Hi, this is Kerry on Mad About Adoption. I'm an adoptee and I live in Australia. If you haven't seen my other videos, there's 3 in this series and this is number 4. Before I begin talking about adoption in Australia and its harmful effects, I'd like to share with you the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child, 1959. Now, why I'm reading this is because human rights were violated in this country against mothers and their children through form of forced adoptions. But I would imagine and pretty well know that the human rights violations are going on still today against mother and child. So I just want to read to you Principle 1. So the child shall enjoy all the rights set forth in this declaration. Every child, without any exception whatsoever, shall be entitled to these rights without distinction or discrimination on account of birth or other status, whether of himself or of his family. 3. The child shall be entitled from his birth to a name and a nationality. The child shall enjoy the benefits of social security. He shall be entitled to grow and develop in health. To his end, special care and protection shall be provided both to him and to his mother, including adequate prenatal and postnatal care. Principle 6. The child, for the full and harmonious development of his personality, needs love and understanding. He shall, wherever possible, grow up in the care and under the responsibility of his or her parents, and in any case in an atmosphere of affection and of moral and material responsibility. A child of tender years shall not, save in exceptional circumstances, be separated from his or her mother. Society and the public authorities shall have the duty to extend care to children without a family and to those without adequate means of support. Now, this book was written, Babies Stolen, Releasing the Past, came out of the New South Wales inquiry, which was about 9 years prior to the Federal Senate inquiry into former forced adoptions. There were numerous recommendations that came out of that. And one of them was basically that the New South Wales government apologises. If I remember right, there were 400 mothers alone in that inquiry gave evidence to having their child stolen and taken. And out of the recommendations was this book. Try and find it. Seriously, try and find this book. There were thousands of them printed. And I had trouble just getting this one. And they've effectively were hidden for a long time and kept out of public view because it really exposes a lot of the criminal and illegal practices that occurred against mothers in New South Wales alone. And at present, there's still a lot of things happening in New South Wales that are very, very questionable. And, you know, they've got a history, New South Wales, of stealing a lot of babies. So I want to read to you one of the stories in here. And look, if it's the only thing I do in this video, I think it's highly important that you hear it because it was so indicative of what happened to the mothers. I won't tell you the mother's name. She says that, and this is what she wrote to the inquiry, I'm writing to you of another stolen generation of children, a stolen white generation that for too long has been denied recognition. I do not want to give the impression of negating the enormous loss of our Indigenous families, but to present the truth of non-Indigenous families who suffered the same immense sorrow as the loss of their children. During the 1950s and the 1960s, large numbers of Indigenous children were removed from their families to advance the cause of assimilation. At its peak during the 1950s and 1960s, large numbers of Indigenous children were placed in institutions or foster homes or adopted by non-Indigenous families. From the 1950s to the late 1970s, single non-Indigenous mothers' babies were also routinely removed from their mothers at birth. This was enacted by the negligence of state governments, hospitals, illegal and unethical practices, and the vindictiveness and punishment of religious hierarchy. Our babies were placed in institutions or foster homes, but in the main were adopted by infertile non-Indigenous families. Following the establishment of legal representation for Indigenous children and their families, the practice of removing Indigenous children from their mothers declined in the 1970s. Non-Indigenous single mothers were not afforded any legal representation, and so their abuse continued. Hence, the number of non-Indigenous babies being routinely removed continued into the 1980s. The difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous children who were taken from their mothers is that Indigenous children cherish their families and their past, while non-Indigenous children have contempt for their mothers because they believe the lie that we did not want them. Those who used illegal and unethical means to procure our children, a crime under law, then decried us as relinquishing mothers, a truly cruel and false expression, created to present to society mothers who would willingly give away their own children. Even though some Indigenous mothers signed a consent to adoption, they have never been referred to as relinquishing mothers. Those who stole our babies literally took them from their mothers' wombs, breasts, and arms before any consent to adoption had been signed. Illegal abduction. They showed no compassion and displayed only coldness and disinterest in us. They took our babies and then discarded us, cruelly uttering that we would have our own baby later one day in the future. Many mothers did not have another child due to the trauma they experienced in losing their firstborn, and it's really estimated that 40% of the mothers that had their child stolen by unethical and criminal practices never had another child. She says that she held her son many times in the first few days of life, which would have been quite rare because normally they just took the child and hid it in the hospital. She said she loved him with the same passion that all new mothers experience. I rejoiced in his life and never believed for one moment that she would lose her child. How wrong I was, she says. The staff at the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church ensured that not only would my son be taken from me for nothing more than being unmarried, but that he would also grow up believing that I did not want him, and now holds the view that I was a mother without feeling who could hand him over to strangers without a backward glance. I have grown older with my own son growing older, yet not of my family. I cannot know his legal name, nor am I allowed to know if he is alive or dead. There has never been a day in my life I have not thought of him. I still to this day do not understand how the cruelty of those who presented a false veil of trust and caring to society could have separated me from my own child. She says, I am the only one of at least 250,000 non-Indigenous Australian mothers who were treated in similar ways. There were supposed to have been laws to protect my baby and me, yet those whose prejudices could be manipulated into their reality abuse those laws. This manipulated reality has been perpetuated throughout the past few decades by the very organisations that are responsible for the abduction of our children. They have successfully perpetually created for society an acceptance of a class culture. The infertile married woman have the right to another baby, regardless of the rights of the original mother, the mother that gave birth to that child. We have an acceptance in society now of the pain and suffering of the mothers of the Indigenous stolen generation. However, in our supposed democratic society, we non-Indigenous mothers have been denied any recognition of our stolen babies. In fact, quite the opposite. We are told that our babies were taken in the best interest of us both. Who made this assumption? Who allowed hospitals to tell mothers they could not see their babies and that they had no right to hold them? Suckle or rear their own babies was not allowed. Who allowed this brutal exercise in social engineering to occur? Who? Now, I want to add to this some quotes that were in the Medical Journal of Australia dated 1960 from an obstetrician, and he says the last thing that an obstetrician might concern himself with is a law in regard to adoption. So here we have a Mr. Lawson, a D.F. Lawson of the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne, being quoted in the Medical Journal to other obstetricians: ignore the law. Mr. Lawson also went on to give class distinction examples of how low on the ladder of life single mothers were. He arrogantly assumed himself to be the pinnacle of creation. He quoted another obstetrician, Dr. Stevenson: "There are men and classes of men who stand above the common herd. The soldier, the sailor, and the shepherd not infrequently, the artist rarely as still the clergyman, the physician almost as a rule. He is the flower of our civilization." Oh boy, that was the era that I was adopted in. So they saw single mothers as being the scum of the earth, and that doctors and medical staff were above the law, flowers. Seriously, this is what our mothers were subjected to. This is what adoptees were subjected to. And, you know, I can't but help make a comparison between the wording and picture that our society now paints of people on welfare. I kind of get the same impression that the same thing is being said about many of the mothers who are single today, and the many children that are now taken into care. I'll admit that there are children that are being abused, and that the parents that are doing this should be punished by the law. But there are many loving parents who are just struggling. We have a society that, you know, if you've got one working parent, it is so hard. And the pressure that is on parents to, you know, give their children the best education and the best laptop and the best video games and whatnot. And there are parents out there that are struggling and can't do it. But should that be an excuse to take your child? Should that be an excuse just because you're poor to take your child? I don't think so. Not by the Human Rights Commission. We treat third world countries better, the people in those countries with aid, billions of dollars in aid, but we do very little for our own citizens who are struggling here. So educate yourselves on what was done in the past, how it was done, and why it was done. And I can tell you now that history is slowly being repeated, that there is a decided effort by media and certain members of parliament and certain actors that come into this country and lie to you. And they create this persona that anybody on welfare is a drudge on society, and certainly creates this story that their children need to be taken and adopted out. Stay tuned. There's more. Number 5 is coming up. Thank you.